Number 10. The Sudarium of Oviedo. Some relics divide history because they are famous. The Sudarium of Oviedo is more unsettling because it lives in the shadow of a more famous cloth and yet refuses to disappear. Housed in the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, Spain, the Sudarium is a blood-stained cloth traditionally associated with the face of Jesus after the crucifixion. Unlike the Shroud of Turin, it does not present an image of a body. It is smaller, rougher, more easily overlooked by the broader public imagination. And yet that very difference is part of what makes it so historically provocative. It does not offer spectacle in the same way. It offers correlation. That is where the argument begins. Believers have long treated the Sudarium as a deeply important relic in its own right, but much of the modern fascination around it comes from claims that its bloodstain patterns may correspond in significant ways with those on the Shroud of Turin. If the two cloths were truly connected to the same wounded body, the implications would be extraordinary. One relic would no longer stand alone. It would appear inside a network of material witness, each cloth seeming to reinforce the other. That possibility gives the Sudarium unusual power, because relic debates often turn on isolation. A single object can be dismissed as forgery, error, pious invention, or medieval devotion given physical form. But when a second object appears to align with the first, the emotional force increases dramatically. Suddenly the question is no longer just whether one cloth is authentic. It becomes whether multiple traces point back toward the same sacred event. That is exactly why the Sudarium has remained so charged. It transforms relic controversy into a more complicated and more dangerous puzzle. And yet the doubts remain powerful. Skeptics argue that pattern correlation is not the same as proof, and that the history of relic culture is already full of objects whose significance grew through tradition, veneration, and retrospective interpretation rather than secure provenance. The Sudarium's documented history, like that of many revered objects, becomes clearer only after the earliest centuries have already passed into uncertainty. And once uncertainty enters a relic's chain of custody, argument becomes almost impossible to close. Believers see continuity, critics see accumulated legend. That is the real fault line. Because the Sudarium does not divide history through spectacle alone, but through method. What counts as evidence here? Blood pattern analysis, historical references, liturgical continuity, the emotional logic of tradition, or the stricter demands of modern skepticism? Different communities answer that question differently, and once they do, they are no longer merely debating cloth. They are debating how sacred history is allowed to survive materially at all. That is why this relic remains so compelling. It is quieter than the Shroud, less culturally dominant, and yet in some ways more destabilizing because it seems to offer support without closure. It lives in the charged space between corroboration and ambiguity, enough to fascinate, not enough to finish the argument, and in religious history, that is often the most divisive condition possible. The Sudarium of Oviedo belongs on this list because it shows how even a lesser-known relic can become a pressure point between faith and scrutiny, not by overwhelming the world with certainty, but by standing beside a larger mystery and making it harder to dismiss cleanly. Number 9. The Crown of Thorns. Some relics divide history because they are hard to verify. The Crown of Thorns divides history because it sits at the intersection of suffering, kingship, prestige, and the desperate human desire to touch the Passion through something tangible. Traditionally associated with the crown placed on Jesus before the crucifixion, the relic known as the Crown of Thorns became one of the most revered objects in Christendom. Its significance was immediate and emotionally devastating. This was not a relic tied to triumph or resurrection first. It was tied to humiliation, pain, mockery, and the transformation of torture into sacred memory. To possess such a relic was to claim proximity to one of the most intimate and terrible moments in Christian narrative. That made it spiritually priceless. It also made it politically explosive. Over centuries, the crown's history became entwined with imperial custody, royal ambition, crusading prestige, and the symbolic economy of medieval Christianity. When King Louis IX of France acquired what was venerated as the crown of thorns in the 13th century, he did not merely obtain a devotional object. He brought into France one of the greatest relics in the Christian world and built the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris in part to house it. That act fused sanctity and monarchy with astonishing clarity. The relic was no longer just about Christ's suffering, it became part of the sacred legitimacy of a kingdom. That is where division deepened, because the more elevated the relic became, the more it invited competing responses. For the devout, it was a bridge across time, a material witness to the Passion, a focus of reverence capable of sanctifying cities, rulers, and pilgrims alike. For critics, especially in later eras, the crown represented a larger problem embedded in relic culture itself: the multiplication of sacred claims around objects whose early provenance was often impossible to fully secure. Was this truly the crown? Or had devotion, politics, and prestige turned a fragmentary tradition into institutional certainty? That question could never be asked lightly, because to doubt a relic like the crown of thorns was not merely to question an object. It was to question centuries of veneration, royal patronage, liturgical life, and the way sacred authority had been distributed across Christian civilization. That is why relic controversies often become so emotionally violent. They threaten not just belief, but the visible structures belief has built around itself. And the crown has always carried another layer of tension. Unlike a relic associated with hidden tombs or remote miracles, the crown of thorns became one of the most publicly exalted sacred objects in Europe. Its visibility made it powerful, but also vulnerable. It could unite devotion through ceremony and display, yet the same prominence made it a magnet for skepticism, reformist criticism, and the broader modern suspicion that relic culture too often confuses reverence with possession. The more central the object became, the more fiercely its meaning had to be defended. That is what makes it so historically divisive. The crown of thorns is not only a relic, it is a test case for whether material holiness can survive the demands of modern doubt. It asks whether continuity of veneration is itself a kind of evidence, whether the sacred can remain historically meaningful when the archive is incomplete, and whether objects tied to suffering must be judged differently from those tied to power. No answer closes those questions neatly. And because it was bound so tightly to monarchy, architecture, pilgrimage, and devotion, the crown became one of the clearest examples of a relic that shaped public history by being believed. That is why it belongs here. Not because the argument around it is simple, but because it never was. The crown of thorns divided history by becoming too important to sit quietly inside faith alone. Once kings guarded it, churches housed it, pilgrims wept before it, and skeptics questioned it, the relic ceased to be merely an object of devotion. It became a battlefield over what sacred authenticity means when the thing in question has already changed the world by being treated as real. Number 8. The Turin Eucharistic miracle claims. Some religious mysteries divide history because they rest on one famous object. The Eucharistic miracle claims associated with Turin are more unsettling because they belong to a larger pattern inside Christianity itself. The moment when bread and wine are said not merely to symbolize the sacred, but to rupture visibly into it. That is what gives such claims their power. In Catholic tradition, Eucharistic miracles are moments when the consecrated host is believed to manifest blood, flesh, incorruptibility, or some other extraordinary sign that seems to confirm the reality of the sacrament in material form. Turin, already one of the most charged sacred cities in Europe because of its association with the Shroud, became linked in devotional memory to claims of this kind as well. That matters because when one city gathers multiple layers of sacred materiality, cloth, blood, host, miracle, the atmosphere around it changes. It stops feeling like a location of isolated devotion and starts feeling like a zone where heaven repeatedly breaks through matter. For believers, that concentration can feel confirming. For skeptics, it can feel suspicious. And that is exactly where division begins. Because Eucharistic miracles occupy one of the most sensitive fault lines in Christian history. They are never only about whether a strange event occurred. They are about doctrine, about the real presence, about whether the sacrament is symbolic, mystical, literal, or physically transformable in ways human beings can witness. Once a miracle claim appears in that territory, it does not stay local for long. It becomes ammunition, reassurance, scandal, inspiration, or embarrassment depending on who is looking. That is why Turin matters in this context. A city already burdened with one of Christianity's most contested relic traditions becomes the ideal place for additional miracle claims to gain emotional force. One sacred mystery reinforces another. Pilgrimage deepens. Institutional memory thickens, devotion becomes cumulative, and with each layer the distinction between faith history and evidence history grows harder to maintain. The host is no longer just a host, it becomes part of a sacred geography of proof. But proof is precisely the problem. Because miracle claims that seem spiritually overwhelming are often historically frustrating. They come to us through testimony, liturgical tradition, devotional transmission, and later retelling, all powerful forms of memory, but not always forms that modern critical history accepts easily. The more a miracle touches doctrine, the more carefully it will be scrutinized. Were the reports contemporary? Were they embellished? Did later devotion stabilize an uncertain event into accepted wonder? Was natural explanation ever ruled out? These questions do not destroy faith, but they do divide communities trying to decide what kind of evidence sacred history requires. And the Eucharist makes that division sharper than almost anything else. A blood-stained relic can be revered from a distance. A Marian image can be contemplated. A vision can be debated. But a Eucharistic miracle goes straight to the center of liturgical life. It asks whether the most routine sacred act in Christian worship can become visibly supernatural in public time. That is not a marginal question. It destabilizes the border between ritual repetition and divine interruption. For some, that is the deepest reassurance possible. For others, it is exactly the sort of claim that invites pious exaggeration or institutional overreach. That is why the Turin Eucharistic miracle claims belong here. Not because one single episode neatly settles anything, but because they represent a recurring and intensely divisive pattern, the attempt to locate doctrinal truth in transformed matter. In a place already saturated with sacred controversy, such claims become even more loaded. They ask believers and skeptics alike whether holiness must remain invisible to be authentic, or whether God sometimes leaves visible signs precisely because the age demands them. And history never answers that question quietly. Number 7. The blood of Saint Januarius. Some relics divide history because they are ancient. The blood of Saint Januarius divides history because it appears to move. In Naples, the relic associated with Saint Januarius, or San Gennaro, has been the center of one of the most famous and enduring miracle traditions in the Christian world. The substance preserved in sealed ampules is said, on certain feast days and ritual occasions, to liquefy in the presence of the saints faithful. For believers, this is not a vague symbol. It is a living miracle repeated across generations, woven into the emotional and religious identity of an entire city. That alone would make it powerful. But repetition is exactly what makes it so divisive. A one-time wonder can drift into legend. A recurring wonder demands judgment, because if the blood truly liquefies again and again under ritual conditions, then the miracle seems to refuse burial in the distant past. It remains active, almost liturgical in rhythm, as though sanctity itself is still participating in civic and religious life. That is extraordinarily compelling to devotion. It turns the saint from memory into presence. Naples does not only remember Januarius, In some sense, it waits for him, and waiting creates tension. The liquefaction is not merely a private event of mystical consolation. It has long been watched, recorded, discussed, and emotionally interpreted. When it happens, it is welcomed as blessing, continuity, reassurance. When delays or irregularities occur, anxiety rises. The miracle becomes entangled with public fear, civic feeling, and the old human tendency to read sacred signs as commentary on the state of the world. That means the relic does not live only inside theology. It lives inside the psychology of a city. That is why skeptics cannot simply treat it as an obscure devotional curiosity. The event has too much social force, and where there is social force, there is scrutiny. Critics have long proposed naturalistic explanations, chemical behaviors, thixotropic substances, changes in viscosity under certain conditions, and other mechanisms that might account for the phenomenon without requiring divine intervention. Believers respond that reduction misses the point, or that the consistency, timing, and devotional setting of the event exceed ordinary explanation. The two sides often end up arguing past one another because they are not only debating a substance, they are debating what counts as miracle in a world where matter can be tested but meaning cannot. That is where the blood of St. Januarius becomes historically fascinating. It is not simply a relic, it is a recurring challenge to the modern desire for settled categories. If the liquefaction is miraculous, then the sacred remains materially active in a way many modern people find difficult to absorb. If it is natural, then one of the most beloved miracle traditions in Catholic Europe must be reinterpreted through chemistry and custom without destroying the faith built around it. Neither path is emotionally easy. That is why the relic continues to divide history rather than merely decorate it. And Naples intensifies everything. This is not a cold museum setting. It is a city of devotion, volatility, beauty, danger, memory, and theatrical spiritual life. In that environment, the saint's blood becomes more than an object of wonder. It becomes part of the city's pulse. The miracle tradition persists not because it is abstractly interesting, but because it is lived. It is awaited, feared, celebrated, and narrated as part of communal existence. That makes critical distance harder, but also more necessary for those who want to examine it historically. The blood of St. Januarius belongs on this list because it shows how a relic can become a recurring public event that neither faith nor skepticism has ever managed to fully settle. It is too repeated to dismiss casually, too contested to universalize cleanly, too woven into civic identity to treat as a mere curiosity. And perhaps that is why it remains so powerful. A relic that sits silently in a shrine can inspire reverence, a relic that seems to change before witnesses can command an entire city's imagination. And once that happens, history is no longer deciding only whether a miracle occurred. It is deciding how to live with one that never stops returning. Number 6. The image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Some sacred objects divide history because they are contested relics. The image of Our Lady of Guadalupe divides history because it is not only a relic, it is an identity. According to Catholic tradition, in 1531, near present-day Mexico City, the Virgin Mary appeared to an indigenous convert, Juan Diego, and left her image miraculously imprinted on his tilma, a cloak made of cactus fiber. That story became one of the most powerful religious narratives in the Americas. It linked apparition, image, conversion, and sacred legitimacy into one event so emotionally potent that it helped shape the spiritual history of an entire continent. That alone would make it historically immense. But what makes Guadalupe so divisive is that it never remained only inside devotion. The image became bound up with colonial encounter, indigenous memory, evangelization, resistance, nationalism, and the struggle over how Christianity took root in the New World. For believers, the tilma is not simply a picture. It is a miraculous sign of divine intervention, maternal protection, and sacred closeness to the people of Mexico. For critics, historians, and skeptics, the image raises another set of questions. When was it first documented clearly? How did the tradition develop? How much of the narrative reflects immediate event, and how much reflects later devotional consolidation under colonial conditions? That is where the fault line opens, because Guadalupe sits at the meeting point of miracle and empire. An apparition to an indigenous man in the aftermath of conquest carries enormous meaning. It can be read as consolation, sacred accommodation, divine localization, or spiritual reordering of a shattered world. But it can also be examined as part of the broader historical process by which Catholicism established itself in colonial society, often through the fusion of faith, power, and cultural adaptation. The same image that inspires tears and pilgrimage can also provoke hard questions about memory, authorship, and institutional shaping. And the image itself intensifies everything. The tilma is visually unforgettable. It does not function like a hidden relic locked away in obscurity. It is reproduced endlessly, carried publicly, venerated massively, and embedded in the emotional life of millions. That scale matters. A miracle seen by a few may remain local. A miracle image absorbed into national and transnational identity becomes something else entirely. It becomes too important to remain historically quiet. The question is no longer only whether the image is miraculous. It is what happens to a society when a miracle claim becomes one of its deepest symbols. That is why Guadalupe has never been merely devotional. It has political life, cultural life, historical life. It has appeared in moments of resistance, independence, suffering, and collective imagination. The Virgin of Guadalupe became not only a figure of piety, but a mother symbol of belonging. That makes skepticism toward the tradition emotionally charged in a way many relic debates are not. To question the historical formation of Guadalupe can feel to many like questioning far more than a miracle. It can feel like questioning a people's sacred memory of themselves. And yet historians must still ask, what can be known from the earliest sources? How did the cult emerge and expand? What layers of narration were added over time? Is the image itself best understood as miraculous origin, artistic object, devotional synthesis, or some unstable combination of all three? These are legitimate questions, but they often collide with a devotional reality that does not experience the tilma as a puzzle. It experiences it as presence. That difference is why Guadalupe belongs here. Few sacred images have divided history so completely while also uniting believers so powerfully. It is a miracle claim, yes. But more than that, it is a sacred symbol whose historical implications spread across theology, colonialism, race, nationhood, and identity. It cannot be reduced to art, it cannot be reduced to fraud, it cannot be reduced to pure faith untouched by history either. It lives precisely in the unstable territory between them. And that instability is what gives it such force. Because when an image becomes a nation's wound, mother and miracle at once, history no longer has the luxury of treating it as neutral. Number 5, the True Cross relics. Some relics divide history because one object is doubted. The relics of the True Cross divide history because there were too many of them. According to Christian tradition, the True Cross was the actual cross on which Jesus was crucified. If any relic could claim ultimate significance in the material memory of Christianity, this was it. Not cloth touched by the body, not blood preserved in vials, not bone from a saint. The wood of the crucifixion itself. The instrument of execution transformed into the central sign of redemption. To possess even a fragment of such an object was to claim unimaginable sacred prestige. And over time, many did. Relics said to come from the True Cross spread across Christendom. Churches, monasteries, cathedrals, and treasuries claimed fragments. Some were tiny splinters, others were larger pieces enclosed in elaborate reliquaries. The cult of the cross became one of the most emotionally powerful and politically useful forms of Christian devotion. Pilgrims sought proximity to it, rulers prized it, clergy defended it, liturgies exalted it. The true cross was not merely remembered, it was distributed. That is where the problem began, because distribution creates multiplication, and multiplication creates skepticism. How many fragments could plausibly come from one cross? Were all of them authentic? Some of them? None of them. Critics, especially from the medieval period onward, and then much more forcefully during the Reformation and modern historical scrutiny, pointed to the sheer proliferation of claimed relics as evidence of exaggeration, fraud, pious commerce, or institutional credulity. The true cross became one of the classic examples used by skeptics to argue that relic culture had crossed from devotion into absurdity. And yet the mockery never fully settled the matter, because relic authenticity is rarely judged only by volume. For many believers, the point was never crude arithmetic. A fragment of the cross could be venerated because it stood inside tradition, liturgy, and continuity of faith. The sacred meaning did not depend entirely on whether modern historical method could certify a chain of custody back to Golgotha. To critics, that sounds like evasion. To believers, it sounds like misunderstanding what relics are for. This is the deeper divide. Is a relic primarily a historical artifact to be verified, or a devotional vessel whose meaning survives incomplete proof? The true cross pushes that question to its limit. Because unlike more obscure relics, it sits at the very center of Christian symbolic life. To doubt the fragments is not to doubt the crucifixion itself, but it does expose how much medieval and later Christianity invested in the physical possession of sacred history. That is why the relics became so controversial. They reveal the old longing not just to remember salvation, but to hold it, to enclose it in gold, carry it in procession, place it in altars, and let matter itself serve as testimony. That longing is historically powerful. It shaped architecture, pilgrimage, trade, ecclesiastical prestige, and political legitimacy. Fragments of the cross did not remain private devotional curiosities. They influenced public religion. A church that possessed a relic of the true cross stood differently in the sacred geography of the Christian world. Its claim to importance deepened. Its place in networks of pilgrimage and reverence expanded. So even if skepticism rose, the historical effect of the relic tradition had already become enormous. That is why the true cross relics belong on this list. They divided history not because people cared too little, but because they cared too much. The more central the cross became, the more irresistible it was to fragment, distribute, claim, doubt, defend, and reinterpret. It became both the holiest possible relic and one of the clearest examples of the difficulty of relic culture under scrutiny. Too sacred to ignore, too multiplied to leave unquestioned. And perhaps that is the most revealing part. The relics of the true cross show that devotion and doubt often grow strongest around the same object. Because the holier the thing is believed to be, the more the world demands proof. And the more proof is demanded, the more faith and history begin pulling in opposite directions. Number 4. The Lourdes Apparitions. Some miracles divide history because they are ancient and remote. The Lourdes Apparitions divide history because they belong to the modern world. That matters more than it first seems. A vision in the distant medieval past can survive inside legend almost untouched. A vision in the 19th century enters a different battlefield entirely, one shaped by newspapers, medical scrutiny, institutional investigation, political conflict, mass pilgrimage, and the unsettling possibility that a sacred event might unfold under conditions modern people consider testable. In 1858, in Lourdes, France, a young girl named Bernadette Soubirous reported a series of apparitions of the Virgin Mary at the grotto of Massabielle. Bernadette was poor, sickly, socially vulnerable, and in no obvious position to command the attention she eventually drew. That is part of what made the story so powerful from the beginning. Apparitions often take hold most forcefully when they emerge through someone the world would normally overlook. A child, a peasant, someone without status, someone difficult to explain as an architect of elaborate deception. And once Bernadette began describing what she saw, the world did what it always does with such claims. It divided. For believers, the apparitions quickly became evidence of divine closeness, Marian intervention, and the possibility that grace still entered history visibly even in an age of skepticism. For critics, the case raised more familiar possibilities: suggestion, pious imagination, psychological strain, social contagion, institutional opportunism. The fact that Bernadette's experiences led to the discovery or emphasis of a spring, later associated with healings, only intensified everything. Now the question was no longer just whether a girl had seen a vision. It was whether the sacred had marked a place physically enough for bodies to be changed there. That is when Lourdes became more than a local event. It became a system. Pilgrims came, testimonies spread, claims of healing multiplied, church authorities investigated, doctors observed, records were kept, committees formed. The grotto ceased to be just a site of apparition and became one of the most famous centers of pilgrimage and miracle expectation in the modern world. That transformation is crucial to why Lourdes divided history so deeply. It did not remain a private vision protected by obscurity. It entered the mechanisms of public verification and public doubt at the same time, and those mechanisms never fully reconciled. The Church recognized the apparitions as worthy of belief, and Lourdes became one of the central shrines of Catholic devotion. Yet recognition did not dissolve skepticism. The healings especially became the core of ongoing argument. Some cases appeared dramatic, some seemed medically difficult to explain, others looked less extraordinary under scrutiny. Institutions emerged to examine claims carefully, which gave Lourdes a strange dual identity. It was both a site of faith and a site where faith repeatedly invited examination without ever surrendering itself to examination completely. That tension is exactly what gives Lourdes its enduring force. Because the shrine does not merely ask whether miracles happen, it asks whether modernity can ever know what to do with them if they do. If a healing is unexplained, is it miraculous? If it is later explained, does that erase the devotion built around it? If only a tiny fraction of reported wonders survive the strictest scrutiny, does that weaken the place or strengthen it by showing caution? Lourdes became a living confrontation between devotional experience and modern standards of evidence, and neither side has ever fully succeeded in claiming the ground. Then there is the political dimension. 19th century France was not a neutral religious landscape. It was shaped by fierce tension between church and state, belief and secularism, traditional piety, and modern suspicion. That means Lourdes did not rise only as a spiritual site. It rose inside a nation already arguing over whether religion still had legitimate public authority. In that context, every healing, every procession, every investigation, and every skeptical attack became part of a broader struggle over what kind of civilization France, and by extension the modern West, was becoming. That is why Lourdes belongs here, because it shows how a Marian apparition can become far more than a private act of faith. It can become a permanent line of division between those who see grace entering history and those who see psychology, institution, and desire shaping meaning around uncertainty. Lourdes does not close that divide. It ritualizes it. Millions come seeking consolation, healing, or sacred nearness. Millions of others remain unconvinced or openly doubtful. And somehow the shrine continues to live in that fracture without being destroyed by it. That may be its deepest historical significance. Lourdes turned vision into geography, geography into pilgrimage, and pilgrimage into one of the modern world's most sustained arguments over whether holiness can still break into matter under the gaze of medicine and doubt. And history has never stopped arguing there. Number 3. The holy foreskin. Some relics divide history because they are majestic. The holy foreskin divides history because it is almost unbearably intimate. That is what makes it so strange and so historically explosive. If the relic were genuine, it would be a physical remnant of Jesus' circumcision, a fragment of Christ's body retained after birth, and therefore one of the most direct imaginable links between incarnation and materiality. It is difficult to think of a relic more theologically charged or more likely to produce discomfort. The object sits exactly where devotion, embodiment, and embarrassment collide, and that collision shaped its entire history. In medieval and early modern Christianity, relic culture was expansive enough to absorb almost anything connected to the life of Christ or the saints. Yet the holy foreskin stood apart because it forced believers to confront something the devotional imagination often preferred to spiritualize rather than anatomize. The incarnation meant real flesh. The circumcision meant real flesh cut. If a relic survived from that moment, then theology could not remain abstract. It had to become bodily in the most unsettlingly specific way. That specificity attracted both reverence and ridicule. Over time, multiple claims to possess the holy foreskin appeared, which only deepened controversy. Churches and local traditions attached prestige to such claims. The relic could become a focus of devotion, status, and sacred distinction. But the multiplication of claimants also made the object an easy target for mockery, skepticism, and reformist criticism. Once more than one community claimed the same intimate relic, the whole matter began to look, to many observers, like a grotesque example of how relic culture could slide from reverence into absurdity. And yet the relic would not simply disappear into laughter, because underneath the discomfort lay a real theological question. Christianity insists that Christ became fully human, not symbolically human, fully human. The holy foreskin, precisely because it seemed so awkward, dramatized that claim more sharply than many grander relics ever could. It reminded believers that incarnation was not clean, abstract, or safely distant. It involved a body subject to birth, blood, pain, and ritual marking under Jewish law. In that sense, the relic's offensiveness to refined religious taste may have been exactly what made it spiritually dangerous and compelling. That is why it divided history so strongly. For some, the relic was a holy witness to the reality of Christ's humanity. For others, it was a scandal, a pious excess, a relic too absurd to defend, or a humiliation of serious religion. As Europe moved through reform, skepticism, and changing standards of what public devotion should look like, the holy foreskin became increasingly difficult to handle. It was too bodily for polite faith, too famous to ignore, too ridiculous to many modern eyes, and too theologically charged to dismiss without raising deeper questions about relics altogether. That made it radioactive. The relic became entangled with broader Catholic-Protestant tensions over the legitimacy of relic veneration, the boundaries of devotion, and the degree to which material Christianity could become corrupted by appetite for sacred objects. A relic like the crown of thorns could still command solemn reverence across wide audiences. The holy foreskin forced a more destabilizing response. It tested whether believers truly accepted the physical logic of incarnation or only the parts of it that could be aesthetically elevated. And over time, silence began doing what debate could not. The relic did not disappear from memory because it was resolved. It disappeared because it became too difficult, too controversial, too embarrassing, and too vulnerable to mockery in an age increasingly uncomfortable with the more excessive reaches of medieval piety. That process is historically revealing. Sometimes religion does not abandon an object because it has been disproven. It abandons it because the object exposes tensions no one wants to keep staging publicly. That is why the holy foreskin belongs so high on this list. Few relics reveal more clearly how devotion can be destabilized by its own logic. If Christianity is fully incarnational, then even the most intimate bodily traces of Christ can become sacred. But once those traces become objects of cult, the boundary between profound theology and grotesque absurdity becomes terrifyingly thin. The holy foreskin lived exactly on that boundary, and history never found a way to hold it comfortably there. It divided believers because it asked a question too sharp to soften. How physical is sacred history allowed to become before reverence turns into scandal? And no relic made that question harder to avoid than this one. Number 2. The miracle of the sun at Fátima. Some visions divide history because they are private. The miracle of the sun at Fátima divides history because it was public. That is what gives it such extraordinary force. A private apparition can be dismissed as inward experience, delusion, embellishment, or pious memory. But when thousands gather, when expectation builds, when witnesses later insist that the sky itself changed before them, the event becomes much harder to contain. It stops being only a matter of devotion. It becomes a problem for history. In 1917, in Fátima, Portugal, 3 shepherd children reported apparitions of the Virgin Mary. That alone would already have attracted attention in a deeply Catholic society living through political strain, anti-clerical tension, and wartime uncertainty. But what transformed the case from local Marian devotion into one of the most famous miracle claims in modern religious history was the promise attached to the final apparition, that a sign would be given for all to see. That promise changed everything, because once a public sign is expected, the event no longer belongs only to the seers. It belongs to the crowd. Believers came, skeptics came, the curious came, journalists came, anti-clerical observers came. The atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Then, on October the 13th, 1917, reports emerged that the sun had appeared to move, spin, change color, plunge, or behave in ways so extraordinary that many witnesses believed they were seeing a miracle unfold over the Oviedo area. That is the heart of the division. For believers, the miracle of the sun became one of the most powerful modern confirmations of Marian intervention and divine sign. It seemed to offer exactly what skeptical modernity claimed to demand. Not a hidden revelation, but a public event, visible to a crowd, leaving behind testimony far too extensive to ignore casually. For skeptics, the same event raised a different set of explanations: optical effects, retinal distortion, atmospheric conditions, crowd psychology, expectation, suggestion, selective memory, or combinations of all of them. The miracle did not settle belief. It intensified the argument over what belief is allowed to count as seeing. That is why Fátima remains so potent. Because this is not merely a contest between faith and disbelief in abstract terms. It is a contest over the reliability of witness under sacred expectation. What happens when large groups gather waiting for heaven to act? Does expectation distort perception or prepare it? If many people report something extraordinary, does number strengthen the case or reveal social contagion more clearly? If some witnesses saw one thing and others saw something different, what kind of event was it? These are not minor questions. They reach into the foundations of how modern people think testimony works. And the political context made the miracle even more charged. Portugal at the time was marked by anti-clerical Republican politics, instability, and tension between secular modernity and Catholic identity. Fátima did not emerge into a vacuum. It emerged into a country already arguing over what public truth, religious authority, and national destiny should look like. That meant the miracle was never only a miracle. It was also a symbolic victory, threat, embarrassment, or rallying point, depending on who interpreted it. The sky over Fátima became a theatre in which wider ideological conflict was projected upward. That is why the event never quieted into simple piety. It generated devotion, pilgrimage, theological reflection, political significance, apocalyptic interpretation, and continued skepticism all at once. The miracle was too public to be privately absorbed and too ambiguous to command universal assent. That combination is historically dangerous in the most revealing way. It means the event can never be forgotten, but also never be universally stabilized. It remains alive because both belief and doubt can keep feeding on it. and perhaps that is its deepest power. The miracle of the sun asks a modern world obsessed with evidence whether it is prepared for the possibility of a public sacred sign, while also asking a believing world whether witness alone can ever overcome the interpretive instability of mass experience. Neither side has ever fully answered the other. And because they cannot, Fátima endures as one of the most divisive miracle events of the 20th century. It was seen by too many to vanish, and explained too poorly to close. That is why it belongs here, not because history knows what happened above Fátima, but because history still cannot agree on what it means when thousands claim the heavens moved, and modernity has no way to seal the sky shut again. Number 1. The Shroud of Turin. Some relics divide history because they are obscure, awkward, or local. The Shroud of Turin divides history because it may be the most famous contested religious object on earth. A linen cloth bearing the faint image of a crucified man, marked with wounds that many believers have associated with the Passion of Christ, the shroud does something few relics ever manage to do. It does not merely invite devotion, it invites investigation. It stands at the exact meeting point of faith, science, art, forensics, medieval history, photography, and the human hunger for proof. That is why it deserves the number 1 position. No relic on this list has so perfectly embodied the war between sacred reverence and critical scrutiny. The emotional force of the shroud is immediate. If genuine, it is almost unthinkably important. A burial cloth of Jesus carrying not only bloodstains, but the mysterious negative-like image of the body itself. If false, then it is one of the most extraordinary and influential religious artifacts ever created. A work of devotion or deception that still managed to reshape global imagination. Those are the only 2 broad possibilities, and neither one is small. Even the most skeptical reading leaves the object historically immense. That is what makes it so dangerous. Because the shroud refuses to stay in one category. It is not just a relic in a reliquary, it is an image. It is not just an image, it is a forensic puzzle. It is not just a forensic puzzle, it is an object of prayer. It is not just an object of prayer, it is a scientific problem that has repeatedly drawn specialists, enthusiasts, doubters, and believers into its orbit. Few sacred objects have generated this level of interdisciplinary obsession. That alone tells you how unstable it is, and instability is exactly where division thrives. For believers, the shroud offers a uniquely intimate confrontation with the Passion, not through artistic imagination, but through what appears to be material witness. For skeptics, the cloth raises equally strong concerns. Its clearly traceable history emerges only in the medieval period. Radiocarbon testing famously suggested a medieval origin, and every claim of extraordinary authenticity seems to generate a counter-argument grounded in contamination, restoration, method, or alternative interpretation. The object sits inside permanent dispute because every apparent resolution opens another chamber of uncertainty. That is why the shroud has never been settled by science alone. Science has examined the cloth repeatedly, but the very act of examination keeps expanding the controversy rather than ending it. Radiocarbon dating became a major turning point, but not a final one. Questions about sample area, repairs, contamination, and fire damage followed. Image formation remains debated. Bloodstain interpretation remains debated. The cloth's history remains debated. Even those who reject authenticity often concede that the shroud is unusually difficult to explain cleanly as an ordinary medieval fabrication. And that concession is enough to keep belief alive at full intensity. The image itself deepens the divide. Photography transformed the shroud's afterlife dramatically, because the negative image seemed to reveal striking detail in ways earlier viewers could not fully appreciate. Suddenly, the cloth no longer looked like a merely faded relic. It looked technologically uncanny, almost as though modern tools were pulling hidden information out of ancient material. That development made the object feel less medieval and more transhistorical, as if it had been waiting for a later age to discover what it contained. Whether that impression is theologically meaningful or psychologically seductive is precisely the kind of question that keeps the argument burning. And the Church's position adds another layer. The shroud is venerated, displayed, protected, and treated with enormous reverence. Yet the Church has often handled it with a careful distinction between devotion and official dogmatic certainty. That caution matters. It allows the relic to remain spiritually powerful without demanding absolute historical closure. But it also preserves the divided condition of the object. The faithful can revere it, scholars can investigate it, skeptics can reject it. The cloth remains exactly where it has long lived, suspended between certainty and impossibility. That suspension is why it dominates this list. The Shroud of Turin is the perfect relic of division because it does not merely ask whether a miracle happened. It asks whether modern people truly know what kind of evidence would satisfy them if one had. A cloth, a body image, blood, wounds, historical gaps, scientific tests, interpretive conflict. It contains all the ingredients of a case that should resolve, and yet never does. The object keeps producing argument because it seems too charged to be ordinary and too uncertain to be conclusive. That is what makes it historically unrivaled. The Shroud has shaped devotion, debate, scholarship, media fascination, and modern religious imagination on a global scale. It is a relic, yes, but it is also a permanent referendum on the relationship between faith and evidence. Believers see sacred trace. Skeptics see medieval artifice or unresolved technique. History sees an object too consequential for either side to leave alone. That is why it is number one. Because no other relic, vision, or miracle on this list better demonstrates how the sacred can become a battlefield once it takes material form under the eyes of a world trained to demand proof, but never able to agree on what proof would look like. The Shroud of Turin does not divide history because it is weak. It divides history because it is almost too powerful for certainty to survive around it.